The chandelier light caught her face for no more than a second, but that second was enough to undo 5 years of careful, calculated silence. Soren Calder, the 7th Duke of Dunmere, had been standing at the edge of his own ballroom, performing the precise social function expected of a man in his position. A nod here, a measured word there. The autumn ball at Dunmere Court was his obligation, not his pleasure, and he endured it the way he endured all public spectacles, with rigid composure and a mind that was already elsewhere, tallying grain yields and drainage costs. 300 guests filled the long gallery. The orchestra played a Viennese waltz. Candles burned in their hundreds, reflected and multiplied in the tall gilt mirrors, until the room seemed to blaze with a restless golden fire. And then, between one breath and the next, he saw her. She was standing near the far entrance, half obscured by a column and by the considerable frame of Lady Pemberton, who was holding court to no one in particular. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, unadorned and almost severe in its simplicity. Her dark hair was drawn back from her face in a style that owed nothing to fashion and everything to economy. She carried no fan. She wore no jewels. And she was watching him. Verity! The name struck him like a physical blow, somewhere beneath his ribs in that territory where reason has no authority. His hand tightened around the stem of his glass. The room, the music, the 300 murmuring voices, all of it receded into a distant hum, and there was only her face, older now, thinner. The girlish softness burned away to reveal something sharper and more defined beneath, but unmistakably, irrevocably hers. Verity Ashworth. His wife, his former wife, the woman who had walked out of this house 5 years ago and vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole. She should not have been here. She could not have been here. The guest list had been compiled by his aunt, Lady Odessa, with the same iron precision she applied to all domestic operations. Every name vetted, every invitation weighed against the scales of rank and reputation. There was no conceivable pathway by which Verity Ashworth could have entered this room. Yet there she stood. Their eyes met across 60 feet of polished parquet and 5 years of unspoken fury, and he saw something in her gaze that he had not expected. Not guilt, not defiance, fear. A raw, startled terror, as if she had not anticipated this encounter any more than he had. She took a half step backward, toward the doorway, toward escape, and then a small hand tugged at the fabric of his coat. Soren looked down. A boy stood at his side. He was perhaps 4 years old, with a thatch of dark hair that fell across his forehead in an unruly wave, and eyes wide and solemn, and the precise shade of tawny brown that Soren saw each morning in his own shaving mirror, that looked up at him with an expression of absolute, unshakable recognition. "Father!" the boy said. He did not whisper it. He did not ask it. He stated it with the plain certainty of a child who has spent a lifetime studying a portrait and has finally found the living original. The word fell into the ballroom like a stone into still water. The nearest guests turned. Conversations faltered. Lady Harcourt's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Soren stood paralyzed, his gaze locked on the small upturned face, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were telling him. The boy had his jaw. He had his brow. He had the slight cleft in his chin that every Calder male had carried for 6 generations. From across the room he heard a sound, a sharp, strangled intake of breath. He looked up. Verity's hand was pressed to her mouth, her face drained of every trace of color. And beside her, clutching at her skirts, were 2 more children. A second boy, identical to the first in everything but the cautious set of his mouth, and a girl, smaller, with her mother's dark hair and her father's brown eyes, peering out from behind her mother's hip with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. 3 of them. There were 3 of them. The waltz played on, but no one was listening. The room had become a theater and every guest in it an unwilling audience to a scene that no amount of careful choreography could have produced. Soren felt the weight of 300 stares settle on him like a physical pressure, but they were nothing, meaningless, compared to the weight of the small hand still gripping his coat, Lady Odessa appeared at his elbow. She had materialized from somewhere in the crowd. Her face, a mask of porcelain composure, but her eyes were wild. Those cold, calculating eyes that had governed this household for a decade darted from the boy at Soren's side to Verity at the far door, and in that single, unguarded instant, Soren saw an expression that did not make sense. It was not surprise. It was recognition. It was the look of a woman confronting something she had believed permanently buried. "Your Grace," Lady Odessa said, her voice pitched low, her gloved hand closing on his arm with a pressure that was a fraction too firm to be merely supportive. "This is clearly some unfortunate woman with a disturbed child. Allow me to have them removed." She reached for the boy. The child flinched and pressed himself against Soren's leg, and the Duke, acting on an instinct older and deeper than thought, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Do not touch him," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the cold, unmistakable finality of a man who has not made a request but issued a command. Lady Odessa's hand froze in midair. Her face went rigid. Across the room, Verity had gathered the other two children close against her. Her posture was protective, her body curved around them like a shield. She was not advancing, she was not retreating. She was simply standing, her eyes fixed on Soren and the boy, her face a battlefield of hope and dread. Soren looked down at the child, at his child, and felt a vast and terrifying tenderness begin to crack open inside his chest. "Who brought you here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The boy pointed across the room past the frozen guests, past the guttering candles, past the silent orchestra, to the woman in the midnight blue gown who stood with two more of his children at her side. "Mama," the boy said. His voice was bright and uncomplicated. "But she does not know I came to find you. I saw the painting in the big hallway. You look like the painting." Soren's gaze lifted from the boy to Verity. The distance between them was no more than the length of a ballroom, but it contained 5 years of silence, 5 years of rage, 5 years of a grief he had transmuted into cold, unyielding duty. She had left him. That was what he had been told. She had chosen to leave, had preferred another man, had found him wanting. He had believed it. He had built a life, a fortress upon that belief. And now, standing in the wreckage of his own autumn ball, with a child who wore his face pressed against his leg, the fortress was falling. He did not cross the room. He did not speak to her. He turned to his butler, Hale, who had appeared with the silent efficiency of long training, his face carefully blank. "Have the blue drawing room prepared," Soren said. His voice was steady now, locked down, stripped of everything. "But command. Escort the lady and her children there. See that they want for nothing. No one is to disturb them. No one." He looked at Lady Odessa as he spoke the final 2 words. His aunt met his gaze, and, for the first time in his memory, looked away first. The ballroom resumed its shallow breathing. The orchestra, at a discreet signal from Hale, began to play again. Guests returned to their conversations with the desperate enthusiasm of people who have witnessed something enormous and wish, above all things, to pretend they have not. The boy, Soren's boy, was led gently away by a young housemaid, back across the long gallery to where his mother stood waiting. Verity took the child's hand, drew him close, and without a single glance backward, followed the maid from the room. Soren watched them go, his son, his sons, his daughter. A family he had not known existed, conjured from thin air in the middle of a waltz. And the woman who had given him that family, the woman he had spent 5 years hating, and the woman whose face, even now, even after everything, he could not look away from the glass in his hand had cracked. He had not noticed the pressure of his own grip. A thin line of champagne ran between his fingers and dripped, unheeded, onto the floor. Lady Odessa was speaking to him. He could hear her voice, low and urgent, shaping words designed to contain, to explain, to control. He was not listening. He was thinking of the boy's hand on his coat, the absolute trust of it, the devastating simplicity of that single word, father. Something was very wrong with the story he had been told 5 years ago. Something was very wrong with everything. He returned to the library after the ball had limped to its premature conclusion. The last carriages had departed in a clatter of hooves and hushed speculation. By morning, the story would be in every drawing room within 30 miles. The Duke of Dunmere's former wife had appeared at his ball with 3 children who bore his face. It was the kind of scandal that fed a county for a season. He sat in the leather chair by the cold hearth, still in his evening clothes, and tried to impose order on the chaos in his mind. He had married Verity Ashworth in the spring of 1891. She had been the daughter of Dr. Gideon Ashworth, the physician who had tended his father through his final illness. She was not of noble blood. She had no fortune, no connections, no pedigree that would satisfy the exhaustive genealogical scrutiny of the Calder family. What she had was a mind of uncommon sharpness, a quietness that was not timidity but concentration, and a pair of gray-green eyes that looked at the world with an honesty so direct it could be mistaken for boldness. He had loved her with a completeness that had astonished him, a man not given to grand emotion. Their courtship had been brief, conducted largely in his father's library over discussions of Herodotus and boundary fences and the migratory patterns of Arctic terns. She had laughed at his seriousness. He had been bewildered by the way her laughter had made the cold stone rooms of Dunmere feel, at last, warm. Lady Odessa had opposed the match with a ferocity that he had, at the time, attributed to snobbery. She had predicted disgrace, social ruin, the dilution of the Calder name. He had overruled her. It was one of the very few times he had exercised his authority against her wishes. The wedding had been small. The first weeks had been, by his austere standards, close to happy. And then, 4 months into the marriage, he had returned from 3 weeks of business in Edinburgh to find her gone. No letter, no explanation. Only Lady Odessa, white-faced and brittle, delivering the news with the surgical precision of a woman who had always known this would end badly. "She has left, Your Grace. She left with a man. A clerk from the village. I tried to stop her, but she would not be reasoned with. He had not believed it. Not at first. He had torn through the house, searched her rooms, demanded answers from every servant, but Verity's belongings were gone. Her wardrobe emptied. Her books, her writing case, her mother's cameo, all of it vanished as if she had planned the departure with care. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that Verity had not packed those things. They had been packed for her and sent after her by Lady Odessa's own maid, a final, cruel efficiency designed to make the departure look willing. He had searched for her. For 3 months he had written letters, hired investigators, chased rumors through half the counties of England. Nothing. She had dissolved into the anonymous mass of the country like salt into water. And gradually, painfully, he had accepted the narrative that Lady Odessa had constructed for him. His wife had found him cold, his house oppressive, his devotion insufficient. She had chosen someone else. The rage had come first, hot and consuming. Then the shame, quieter but more corrosive. He had been a fool. He had married beneath his station, and he had been punished for it in the most humiliating way possible. He had allowed his heart to overrule his judgment, and his heart had been wrong. The wound had calcified into a conviction, harder than grief, a settled permanent certainty that he was not made for intimacy, that his nature was too severe, too cold, too much like the gray stone of his own walls to sustain the warmth another person required. And now, 3 children. His children. A boy who had crossed a ballroom full of strangers and reached for his coat with the confidence of someone reaching for home. Verity must have shown them a portrait, told them stories. But the boy had not approached him with the hesitance of a child meeting a figure from a story. He had approached with certainty, with trust, as if recognizing Soren was not an act of memory but of blood. It was this that haunted him. Not the spectacle, not the scandal, the trust. The unearned, inexplicable trust of a child who had never met him, reaching for his coat as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. Soren pressed his palms against his eyes. The fracture inside him was widening, and he did not know how to stop it. In the blue drawing room, 2 flights above and a world away from the Duke's silent library, Verity Ashworth sat on the edge of a settee and watched her children sleep. They lay together on the wide divan the housemaid had prepared, tangled in a heap as they always were. Rafferty, the eldest by 11 minutes, the bold one, the one who had slipped away from her in the crowd and walked straight into the center of her most carefully guarded secret, was on his back, one arm flung wide, his face peaceful in the way that only sleeping children's faces can be. Stellan, the quiet one, the watcher, lay curled against his brother's side, his thumb near his mouth, though he had given up the habit a year ago. And Nev, her daughter, her smallest, her fierce little bird, was wedged between them, her dark hair spread across the cushion, one tiny hand still clutching the fabric of Stellan's shirt. They were safe. For now, they were safe. That was all that mattered. Verity's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees and willed them to stop. The evening had been a catastrophe, a complete and irreversible unraveling of the plan she had spent 7 months constructing. She was not supposed to have been seen. She was certainly not supposed to have been recognized. She had come to Dunmere Court as Mistress Vale, the governess, accompanying the Pemberton family. A quiet, efficient, invisible woman, in a dark gown whose only purpose was to manage the Pemberton children during the ball while their parents socialized. The Pembertons were new to the county. They did not know her history. They did not know that the woman they had hired to teach their daughters arithmetic and watercolor had once walked these halls as the Duchess of Dunmere. The plan had been simple: attend in her capacity as governess, remain in the nursery wing with the children, wait until the household was consumed by the ball, and then, in the small hours, search the one room in this house that held the answers she had come for. But Rafferty had ruined everything. He had slipped away from the nursery while she was settling the Pemberton girls to sleep. He had wandered the corridors of the great house, drawn by the distant music and the golden light, and he had found the portrait gallery. And in the portrait gallery, he had found the painting of his father. Verity knew the painting. It hung at the far end of the gallery, a full-length oil of Soren in his riding clothes, commissioned the year before their marriage. She had stood before it 100 times during those brief, bright months, tracing the familiar lines of his face with her eyes. She had described it to the children because she had promised herself that, whatever else was taken from them, they would know their father's face. She had not anticipated that her son would recognize the living man from the painted one, would walk up to a stranger in a crowded ballroom, and would speak the words she had taught him, the words she had whispered over their cradles in those desperate early months when she had nothing to give them but a name. Father! The word that had detonated her entire world for the second time. She closed her eyes. The memory of that night 5 years ago, the night she had been cast out of this house, rose up as vivid and poisonous as the day it had happened. She had been alone at Dunmere. Soren was in Edinburgh, attending to matters of the estate. Lady Odessa had come to her rooms after dinner, her face arranged in an expression of practiced sympathy that Verity had not at the time recognized as counterfeit. "My dear," the older woman had said, sitting down uninvited, her black silk rustling, "I have something painful to share with you. It concerns my nephew." She had produced a letter. It was written on Soren's stationery in a hand that looked very like his, though Verity would later come to understand. It had been painstakingly copied from samples of his correspondence. The letter was addressed to Lady Odessa. In it, Soren expressed his profound regret at the marriage. He called it an error of judgment, a temporary madness brought on by grief for his dying father. He asked his aunt to manage the situation. He wanted the marriage dissolved quietly. He could not bring himself to face Verity directly, and he trusted Lady Odessa to handle the matter with discretion. A sum of money would be provided. The girl, the letter said, and that word, that casual, dismissive girl, had been the blade that cut deepest. The girl should be made to understand that any attempt to contest the decision would result in public exposure and social ruin. Verity had read the letter twice. She had felt the ground dissolve beneath her feet. The man who had held her in this very house, who had read to her from Ovid by the library fire, who had told her that she had made him believe in the possibility of warmth, that man now called her the girl and wanted her gone. She had not fought. She had not demanded to see Soren. She had not questioned the letter's authenticity, because the idea that a woman of Lady Odessa's standing, a woman who was family, would fabricate such a thing was simply beyond the scope of her imagination. She had packed a small bag. She had accepted the 50 pounds. Lady Odessa pressed into her hand, with a kindness that was in retrospect obscene. And she had walked out of Dunmere Court at dawn, down the long gravel drive, past the gatehouse, and into a life that bore no resemblance to the one she had known. She had discovered the pregnancy 6 weeks later, in a boarding house in Carlisle, where she was working as a seamstress for a dressmaker who paid her barely enough to eat. The triplets had arrived in January in a charity hospital in a room that smelled of carbolic and despair. They had been small, dangerously small, and for the first 3 weeks she had not slept, had barely breathed, convinced that each night would take one of them from her. But they had held on, all 3 of them with a tenacity that she recognized as their father's. She had named them for the things she wanted them to carry. Rafferty for courage, Stellan for calm, Knave for endurance through storm. She had raised them alone, moving from position to position, governess, companion, music teacher, whatever work would allow her to keep her children close. She had told them about their father. She had never spoken of him with bitterness. She had told them he was a good man who did not know they existed, because even in her grief, even in her fury, she could not quite bring herself to believe that the Soren she had loved was truly capable of the cruelty described in that letter. And then, 7 months ago, an old friend of her father's had written to her. Dr. Ashworth's former partner, now retired, had been sorting through a trunk of her father's papers and had found something. A letter, written by Soren to her father, dated 3 weeks after her departure from Dunmere. In it, Soren asked Dr. Ashworth if he had any knowledge of where Verity had gone. The tone was frantic, desperate even. The word Soren used was not girl. The word he used was beloved. That single word had rearranged the architecture of everything she believed. If Soren had been searching for her, then he had not wanted her gone. If he had not wanted her gone, then the letter Lady Odessa had shown her was a forgery. And if the letter was a forgery, then everything, her exile, her poverty, her children's fatherless years, had been constructed by one woman's hand. She had come to Dunmere to find the proof. Somewhere in this house, she believed, the original marriage certificate, the one Lady Odessa had claimed was destroyed as part of the annulment, still existed. Lady Odessa was too methodical, too protective of her own position, to have actually destroyed a legal document. She would have hidden it, kept it as insurance, filed it away in the meticulous records she maintained as the house's unquestioned authority. That document was Verity's claim. It was her children's birthright, and it was somewhere within these walls. But now Rafferty had spoken a single word in a crowded ballroom, and every shadow she had planned to move through was flooded with light. She looked at her sleeping children, their faces soft and trusting in the lamplight, and felt the familiar tightening in her chest that was equal parts love and terror. She had come to this house for justice. She had not come to see him, to feel the old wound torn open by the sight of his face across a room, to watch his hand settle on their son's shoulder with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had been told about him. She had not come to hope. Hope was the most dangerous thing of all. A soft knock broke the silence. Verity stood smoothing her gown, composing her face into the careful blankness that half a decade of servitude had taught her. The door opened. It was not a servant. It was a woman she did not recognize, tall and silver-haired, dressed in traveling clothes that were creased from a long journey, with a face that bore the unmistakable stamp of the Calder bloodline, and eyes that held a warmth the rest of the family seemed incapable of producing. The woman looked past Verity, to the sleeping children on the divan. Her hand went to her throat. She stood very still for a long moment, her gaze moving from one small face to the next, reading each one like a text in a language she had not expected to encounter. Then she looked at Verity, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I am Honoria Calder," she said quietly. "Soren's mother. I arrived an hour ago from the continent." She paused, her voice catching on something old and deep and unresolved. "I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss." Soren did not sleep. He sat in the library until the fire burned to ash, and the first gray light of dawn crept through the tall windows. And then he rose, changed his clothes, and went to find her. He told himself it was an interrogation. He told himself he was owed answers, explanations, an accounting of the last 5 years. He told himself that the cold weight in his chest was anger, nothing more, the righteous fury of a man who had been abandoned and then ambushed in his own home. He told himself all of this as he climbed the stairs to the blue drawing room, and he believed none of it. The door was ajar. He raised his hand to knock, and then he heard them, a child's voice, high and clear. "Mama, is it real? All of it? The house, and the lake, and the horses?" And Verity's voice, low and steady, the voice he had once listened for in every room he entered. "It is real, Rafferty, but it is not ours. You must remember that. But the painting man, he is real too." I touched his coat. He was warm. A pause. Then, softer, with a tremor she was trying to conceal. "Yes, he is real too." Soren stood motionless in the corridor, his hand suspended an inch from the door. Through the gap he could see a narrow slice of the room. Verity was seated on the floor, Nev in her lap, braiding the girl's dark hair with practiced fingers. The two boys sat cross-legged on the rug, each bent over a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil. The scene was so intimate, so utterly domestic, that it struck him with the force of a thing sacred and private that he had no right to witness. He looked at their clothes. The fabric was clean but faded, mended at the elbows and knees with stitches so small and precise they were almost invisible. The kind of mending that spoke not of carelessness, but of its opposite, a fierce, painstaking refusal to let poverty become squalor. Nev's hair ribbon was frayed at the ends. Stellan's shoes, placed neatly by the divan, had been resoled more than once. These were not the trappings of a woman who had run away with a wealthy lover. These were the marks of a woman who had been surviving. Rafferty held up his drawing. "Look, Mama, it is the big house." "I drew it from what I remember." Verity leaned forward, and the smile she gave her son was so full of pain and pride that Soren felt it like a blade between his ribs. "It is beautiful, my love. You have your grandfather's eye." Stellan had not spoken. He was the quiet one. Soren could see that already. The one who observed while his brother declared. The boy was drawing with an intensity that seemed almost devotional, his small hand moving in careful, deliberate strokes. He finished, studied the result for a moment, and then without a word, held the paper out to his mother. Verity took it. Her hand went to her mouth. Soren could not see the drawing from where he stood, but he could see her reaction, the sudden brightness in her eyes, the way she pulled the boy close and pressed her lips to the top of his head.
"It is a very good likeness,"
she whispered.
"Very good indeed."
The boy looked up at her with those tawny eyes, Soren's eyes, and said, "Will he come? The painting man, will he come to see us?" "I do not know, my darling. But whatever happens, you must not be afraid. Your father is a good man. I've always told you that." The words hit Soren like a physical force. She had told them he was good. After everything, after being cast out with nothing, after raising 3 children alone, in what was clearly grinding poverty, she had not poisoned them against him. She had not used them as vessels for her own bitterness. She had given them a father made of kindness and absence, a portrait on a wall, a name whispered in the dark. She had protected his reputation with his own children, at the cost of her own story. What kind of woman did that? Not the kind who leaves in the night with another man. A door opened at the far end of the corridor. Lady Odessa appeared, dressed in her customary black, her silver hair drawn back with the severity of a magistrate. She stopped when she saw Soren standing outside the blue drawing room, and for one unguarded instant, her composure slipped. A calculation moved behind her eyes, quick and sharp, the recalibration of a strategist who has discovered the board has shifted while she slept. "You should not be here," she said, her voice low and taut with controlled urgency. "The entire county is talking. Every family who attended last night will have sent word to their neighbors by now. This woman and her children must leave today before the situation becomes irreparable." "Irreparable for whom?" Soren asked quietly. The question seemed to startle her. She recovered quickly, her chin lifting. "For you, Your Grace. For the name. She is clearly after something. A settlement, perhaps. Recognition for those children. She has trained them, Soren. That boy did not wander into the ballroom by accident. It was staged, designed for maximum humiliation." Soren studied his aunt's face. He had known this woman his entire life. She had been a fixture of Dunmere since before his birth, his father's confidant, the household's iron spine. He had never once questioned her motives. He had never had reason to. But standing here, listening to her, he registered a detail he had overlooked for years. She was not asking about the children. She was not expressing surprise or curiosity or the natural astonishment any person would feel upon learning that 3 children bearing the family resemblance had materialized from nowhere. She was not saying, "Are they really yours?" She was not saying, "How is this possible?" She was saying, "Get them out," as if their existence were not a revelation but a problem she had believed was solved. "The children stay," Soren said. His voice was even, betraying nothing of the storm building inside him, "as does their mother. Until I have had a full accounting of the facts, no one leaves this house." Lady Odessa's jaw tightened. "And what facts do you expect to uncover? The woman left you. She chose to leave. I was here. I saw it." You saw her leave," Soren repeated, his gaze fixed on hers. "But what did you see before that?" For one long suspended moment, aunt and nephew regarded each other in the gray morning light of the corridor. Lady Odessa held his gaze, her expression as rigid and impenetrable as ever. But her left hand, the one she thought he could not see, was gripping the fabric of her skirt so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She inclined her head, a stiff, formal gesture of acquiescence that was anything but surrender. "As you wish, Your Grace." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the stone floor with the precise, measured rhythm of someone already composing her next strategy. Soren watched her go and felt the first cold tendril of a suspicion, so vast and so terrible that his mind instinctively recoiled from it. He did not enter the blue drawing room. Not yet. He was not ready to face Verity, not until he understood what he was facing. Instead, he turned and walked down the main staircase to the library, where he found his mother waiting for him. Lady Honoria Calder was seated in the window seat, a cup of untouched tea beside her, her traveling cloak still draped over the arm of the chair. She had arrived the previous evening from her villa in Florence, summoned by some instinct or some intelligence that she had not yet explained. She looked tired. She looked as if she had not slept either. "Sit down, Soren," she said. It was not a suggestion. He sat. The leather of the chair creaked in the silence. "I have spent the last 3 hours with that young woman," his mother began, her voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of tightly controlled emotion. "I have heard her account of what happened 5 years ago, and I need you to listen to me now with the same openness you would give to a witness in a court of law, because what I am about to tell you will be difficult to hear. I am listening. Verity did not leave you. She was told to leave. She was told that you wanted her gone." The words landed in the silent library like stones dropped from a height. Soren did not move. He did not speak. He waited. On the night before she left this house, she was visited in her rooms by your aunt. Lady Odessa showed her a letter. A letter, she said, was from you. In it, you expressed regret for the marriage. You called it a mistake. You called it a mistake. You asked Odessa to handle the dissolution quietly. Honoria paused. You referred to Verity as the girl. Soren's face drained of color. I never wrote such a letter. No, you did not. But Verity did not know that. She was young, she was alone, she was in a house that had never welcomed her, and the letter was on your stationery, in a hand she believed was yours. She had no reason to suspect forgery. She had every reason to believe that the woman delivering the news, a woman of impeccable standing, a woman who was family, was telling the truth. Why? The word came out raw, stripped of his usual composure. Why would Odessa do this? Honoria looked at her son with an expression of deep, sorrowful frustration, the look of a mother who has watched her child walk into a wall she tried to point out years ago. Because she had plans for you. She always did. The Whitmore girl, the Earl of Branthwaite's daughter. The match had been discussed for years before you met Verity. Odessa had invested considerable social capital in that alliance. Your marriage to a physician's daughter was not merely an inconvenience to her, it was a humiliation, a repudiation of everything she had built. She destroyed my marriage over a social engagement. She destroyed your marriage to protect her position, her authority, her vision of what this family should be. Verity was a threat to all of it, not because she was unsuitable, but because she was loved. Because she had something Odessa could never manufacture through negotiation, your genuine affection. That made her dangerous. Soren stood up. He could not sit. The room was too small, the air too thick. He walked to the window and stared out at the grounds. The gray lake, the dark line of the fells beyond, the landscape of his entire life. The landscape that Verity had walked out of, alone, carrying his children, believing he had sent her away. There is more, his mother said quietly. He turned. When you searched for her, who managed the inquiries? Who corresponded with the investigators? The answer was immediate and devastating. Odessa. And who reported that there was no trace, that the investigators had found nothing? Odessa. The name tasted like ash. Verity told me something else. She discovered the pregnancy 6 weeks after she left. She gave birth to the 3 children in a charity hospital. In Carlisle in the middle of January. They were premature. She was alone. She nearly lost all 3 of them. Honoria's voice cracked. Just once, before she steadied it. She has spent the last 5 years working as a governess, a seamstress, a music teacher. Anything that allowed her to keep her children fed and together. She never sought you out because she believed you had rejected her. She believed every word of that letter. Soren's hands were pressed flat against the window glass. The cold of it seeped into his palms, his bones, his blood. Carlisle. A charity hospital. January. Alone. Then why is she here now? Because 7 months ago, she received a letter, a real one, written by you to her father, Dr. Ashworth, 3 weeks after her departure. You were searching for her. You called her your beloved. Honoria paused to let the word find its mark. That single word told her everything. It told her the letter from Odessa was a forgery. It told her the last 5 years were built on a lie. She came here to find proof. She believes the original marriage certificate still exists somewhere in this house. Odessa told her it was destroyed during the annulment, but Verity believes she kept it. Why would Odessa keep it? Because your aunt has never in her life discarded a document that might serve her interests. She is meticulous. She is careful. And she always keeps her insurance. Soren closed his eyes. Behind them, he saw Verity's face in the ballroom, white with fear. He saw the children, tangled together in sleep. He saw Rafferty's hand on his coat, the absolute trust of a child reaching for a father he had never met. 5 years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of believing the worst. 5 years during which his children had been born and grown and learned to walk and speak and draw pictures of the father they had only ever known as a painting on a wall. And all of it, every wasted day, every empty room, every cold and solitary night, had been built on the foundation of one woman's lie. "What do I do?" he asked. The question was not ducal. It was not composed. It was the question of a man standing in the ruins of everything he thought he knew. Honoria rose from the window seat and crossed the room to her son. She placed her hand on his arm. "You do what your father should have done." "You do what I should have done? Instead of running to Italy to escape my own grief. You find the truth. You protect that woman and those children. And you hold your aunt to account." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice was quiet and unflinching. "You chose to believe Odessa's story because it was easier to be angry than to be heartbroken. Anger has walls, Soren. Grief has none. And you have always preferred walls." He said nothing. There was nothing to say. She was right, and they both knew it. The question that remained, the one that burned in his chest like a coal, was whether the proof Verity needed still existed, or whether Lady Odessa had already begun to destroy it. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Verity waited until the house was silent. The long case clock in the entrance hall had struck 1 before she moved. The children were asleep in the blue drawing room. Rafferty sprawled on his back as always. Stellan curled tight, Nev wedged between them with one fist tangled in her brother's shirt. She had tucked the blankets around them, kissed each forehead, and whispered the same words she whispered every night. "I will come back. I always come back." She had not intended to search tonight. The catastrophe at the ball had changed everything. Her cover was shattered. Lady Odessa knew she was here, knew who she was, and would be moving to eliminate any evidence with the ruthless efficiency that had defined her entire campaign of deception. Every hour Verity waited was an hour for documents to be burned, ledgers to be altered, locks to be changed. She had one advantage. Lady Odessa did not know that Verity knew. She did not know about the letter from Dr. Ashworth's partner. She did not know that Verity had come here with purpose and preparation, not merely as a ghost drifting back to a former life. And she did not know that Verity had spent 7 months quietly researching the layout of Dunmere Court through old household plans she had found in a county archive. Plans that showed something the current maps did not: a small study on the ground floor of the East Wing, adjacent to the housekeeper's quarters, that had been designated as the estate steward's office before Lady Odessa had claimed it as her private domain. That room was the nerve center of Lady Odessa's authority. From it, she managed the household accounts, the staff records, the family correspondence, and, Verity suspected, the evidence of her greatest act of control. Verity moved through the darkened corridors with the particular caution of someone who had once known this house by heart, and now navigated it as enemy territory. She wore dark stockings and no shoes. She carried no candle. She had memorized the route that afternoon during a carefully manufactured visit to the kitchens to fetch warm milk for the children, counting doors, noting which floorboards complained under weight, mapping the pools of moonlight that fell through the windows and the stretches of absolute black where the walls blocked the sky. The East Wing was the oldest part of Dunmere Court, its corridors narrower, its ceilings lower, its stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footfall. The air smelled of damp plaster and old wood. Verity's heart was a fist pounding against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She had lived through worse than this. She had given birth to 3 children in a room with no heat and no help. She had held a premature infant against her chest for 16 hours straight, counting its breaths, willing each one to be followed by another. Fear was an old companion. She knew how to carry it without letting it carry her. Lady Odessa's study door was locked. Verity had expected this. She reached into her hair and withdrew 2 pins, slim and slightly bent. It was a skill she had learned, not from any criminal education, but from a fellow governess in a house in Shropshire, a practical woman who had lost the key to the stationery cupboard once too often and had decided that necessity was a perfectly acceptable teacher. The lock was old, its mechanism simple. It yielded in under a minute. The study was a small, square room, ruthlessly organized. A writing desk against the far wall, a set of mahogany filing cabinets. A shelf of ledgers bound in dark leather, each spine labeled in Lady Odessa's precise hand. A single window, its curtains drawn. The moonlight seeped through a gap in the fabric, laying a thin silver stripe across the desktop. Verity closed the door behind her and began. She worked with a systematic discipline that half a decade of managing chaos had taught her. She started with the filing cabinets, pulling each drawer open just far enough to read the labels of the folders within. Household accounts, staff contracts, correspondence, sorted by year, estate inventories, tax records. Everything was immaculate, every document filed in chronological order, every label written in the same precise, narrow hand. She found the year of her marriage and pulled the folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them, arranged by date. She began to read, her eyes straining in the thin moonlight. The first letter stopped her breath. It was in her own handwriting. A letter she had written to Soren during those first golden weeks, when he was away on business and she was alone in this enormous house trying to make it feel like home. "My dearest," it began. "The library smells of you even when you are not in it, and I find myself inventing reasons to sit in your chair." She had never received a reply. She had assumed he was too busy, too preoccupied with estate matters. Now she understood. He had never received it. Beneath her letter was his reply, written in his hand, his real hand, not the forgery. "My darling V. Your letter reached me this morning, and I have read it 4 times. The thought of you in my chair makes Edinburgh unbearable." Verity pressed the letters against her chest. Her eyes burned, but she would not cry. Not here. Not now. She kept searching. Beneath the intercepted correspondence, she found a smaller folder, unlabeled. Inside were documents of a different character entirely. A receipt from a private investigator in Newcastle, paid in full, with a note in Lady Odessa's hand across the top corner. Reported no findings as instructed. A draft of the forged letter, the one that had destroyed her marriage, with corrections and annotations in the margins, as if it had been practiced, refined, perfected before the final copy was produced. And beneath it all, a ledger page detailing payments. £50 to Mrs. Delaney, Verity's relocation. £20 to Mr. Carswell, the clerk whose name had been used as Verity's supposed lover. £100 to Stedman and Cross, solicitors for the preparation of annulment documents. It was all here. Every thread of the conspiracy, laid out in Lady Odessa's own meticulous hand. But the marriage certificate itself was not among the papers. Verity's hands trembled as she replaced the folders. The certificate was the key. Without it, the other documents were evidence of wrongdoing, but not proof of the marriage's validity. Lady Odessa could claim the annulment was legitimate, that the marriage had been properly dissolved, that the children had no legal claim. She needed to keep looking. She moved to the writing desk. The drawers were locked, but the same hairpins opened them. More papers, more records, bills of sale, invitations, correspondence with tradesmen. Nothing. A sound from somewhere deep in the house. Verity froze, her hand suspended above the open drawer. She listened, every nerve alight, footsteps, slow, deliberate, growing closer. Not the heavy tread of a man's boot, the measured, precise click of a woman's heel on stone. Lady Odessa was awake. Lady Odessa was coming. Verity looked at the papers in her hands, at the open drawers, at the evidence of her intrusion scattered across the desk. There was no time to replace everything. There was barely time to move. She closed the drawers as quietly as she could, gathered the most damning documents, the forged letter draft, the investigator's receipt, the payment ledger, and pressed them flat against her body beneath the fold of her shawl. She crossed the room in 3 silent strides and reached the door. The footsteps were in the corridor, now close, 10 paces away, perhaps fewer. Verity slipped through the door, eased it shut, and pressed herself into the shallow alcove of a servant's entrance. She had noted that afternoon. She flattened her back against the cold stone and held her breath. The footsteps stopped. There was a pause, a silence so complete that Verity could hear her own blood roaring in her ears. Then the sound of a key turning in a lock. The study door opened. A candle's glow spilled into the corridor, catching the edge of the alcove, where Verity stood, missing her by inches. Lady Odessa entered her study. The door closed behind her. And then, from within the room, a sound that turned Verity's blood to ice, a drawer being opened. A long, terrible pause. And then Lady Odessa's voice, low and cold and utterly without warmth. "Someone has been in here." Verity pressed herself deeper into the alcove as Lady Odessa's candlelight spilled through the study door. She heard drawers opening, papers being shuffled, the sharp intake of breath. Then the door opened again, and Lady Odessa emerged into the corridor, candle in hand, her face a mask of cold fury. She looked left. She looked right. The candlelight swept past the alcove, passing over Verity's dark shawl by inches. Then Lady Odessa turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward the main house, her steps quick and purposeful. Verity waited, counted to 60, then moved. She had taken 3 steps toward the servants' staircase when a figure stepped from the shadows ahead of her. Soren. He was fully dressed, standing in the darkened corridor, as if he had been waiting there for hours. His face was unreadable in the darkness, but his eyes caught the faint moonlight from a distant window, and in them Verity saw something she had not expected. Not anger, not suspicion, recognition. He looked at the documents pressed against her chest, at her stockinged feet, at the hairpin still held in her left hand. "You found something," he said quietly. It was not a question. She could have lied. She could have done any of the things that years of survival had taught her to do when cornered. Instead, she did the thing she had not done since the night Lady Odessa had shown her the forged letter. She told the truth. "I found the draft of the letter your aunt used to drive me away," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I found receipts proving she paid the investigator you hired to report nothing. I found proof she bribed the clerk, whose name she used as my supposed lover. I found our letters, Soren, the ones we wrote to each other during those weeks you were in Edinburgh. She intercepted everyone. She held out the documents. He took them." She watched his face as he read there in the dark corridor with nothing but moonlight to see by, and she watched the last walls of half a decade of carefully maintained anger come apart. He read the forged letter first. His lips moved slightly as he took in the words. "The girl should be made to understand." He looked up at her. "This is not my hand," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "It is close, but it is not mine. The capital letters are wrong. I do not cross my letter T this way." "I know that now," Verity said. "I did not know it then." He read on. The investigator's receipt, the payment ledger. And then the letters, their letters, the ones that had been stolen from the post before they could reach their intended hands. He read his own words back to himself, words of longing and affection written to a wife he had adored, words that had never arrived. When he finished, he stood very still. The documents hung at his side. His breathing was uneven, the only crack in his composure she had ever witnessed. "I searched for you," he said. "For 3 months I did not sleep. I wrote to every contact I had. I hired men to look for you in every city and town between here and London." His voice dropped lower. "Odessa told me they found nothing. She told me you had gone willingly, that you had chosen to leave. She said I should accept it and move forward. And you believed her. I believed her because the alternative was unbearable." He met her eyes. "The alternative was that something terrible had happened to you, and I had failed to prevent it." The silence between them was vast and full. It contained 5 years of loneliness, 5 years of sleeping alone and waking alone, and carrying the weight of grief that each had believed was inflicted by the other. It contained 3 children who had never known their father's voice, and a man who had never known they existed. "I need to find the marriage certificate," Verity said, breaking the silence with the practical urgency that had kept her alive through the worst of it. "Without it, Odessa can claim the annulment was legitimate. The children will have no legal standing. We will find it," Soren said, and the word "we," spoken quietly in a darkened corridor at 2 in the morning, was the first real thing that had passed between them in 5 years. Lady Odessa struck at dawn. She appeared in the breakfast room where Soren sat alone, her face composed, her spine straight, but with a brittleness in her bearing that suggested a night without rest. She had rehearsed this. She had spent the dark hours preparing her performance the way she prepared everything, with calculation and precision. "I must report a theft," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "That woman, your former wife, broke into my private study during the night. She has stolen personal documents, private correspondence, financial records. It is a criminal act. I demand she be handed over to the constable." Soren set down his teacup. He did not stand. He did not invite her to sit. He simply looked at her, and the quality of his gaze was something new, something Lady Odessa had never encountered in all her years of managing this household, and she had believed, managing the man who owned it. "Which document specifically are you concerned about?" he asked. Lady Odessa hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, no more, but it was enough. She had not expected the question. She had expected outrage, swift action, the protective reflex of a man whose domestic order had been violated. "Personal papers," she said. "My private correspondence, financial records of the household." "Household records are the property of the estate," Soren said evenly. "Not of the person who keeps them. They're mine." Another hesitation, longer this time. "There were private letters among them, my own correspondence." "With whom?" "That is my private affair." Soren reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it and laid it flat on the table between them. It was the draft of the forged letter, the one with Lady Odessa's corrections in the margins, her handwriting unmistakable. The color left her face as if it had been drained by a valve. "Is this the private correspondence you are referring to?" Soren asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, but beneath it ran a current of fury so deep and so cold that it seemed to change the very air in the room. "Because this appears to be a draft of a letter you wrote in my name to my wife, telling her that I wanted her gone. A letter you refined and corrected until you were satisfied it would pass as genuine. A letter that destroyed my marriage, separated me from my children, and condemned the woman I loved to 5 years of destitution." Lady Odessa stood frozen, her mouth opened, closed, opened again. In all the years Soren had known her, the formidable engine of her self-possession had never once failed to produce words. It failed now. "I also have receipts," Soren continued, his voice flat and relentless. "Payments to the investigator I hired, instructing him to report no findings. Payments to a clerk named Carswell to lend his name to a fiction about an affair that never happened. Payments to solicitors for annulment documents that were never legally valid because the marriage they purported to dissolve was never contested by either party." He stood now, and his height, his breadth, the sheer physical authority of him seemed to fill the room. "You did not protect this family, Odessa. You mutilated it. You tore it apart and buried the pieces, and you let me believe it was my own fault." Lady Odessa's composure shattered, not into tears, not into pleading, but into something harder and more frightening: defiance. "I did what was necessary," she said, her voice climbing to a pitch he had never heard from her. "That girl was unsuitable. She was nobody, a physician's daughter with no name, no fortune, no connections. She would have dragged this family into obscurity. I saved you from a ruinous attachment. Everything I did was for the preservation of this house." You stole my children from me, Soren said, and his voice broke on the word children in a way that silenced the room completely. You let them be born in a charity hospital. You let them grow up without a father. You let them go hungry, so that the Calder name might sit next to the right families at the right dinner tables. Lady Odessa had no answer for this. The scale of what she had done reflected back at her, through the lens of 3 small lives, was something her calculus of rank and reputation had never accounted for. "Where is the marriage certificate?" Soren asked. Her chin lifted. One final, futile act of resistance, destroyed, as part of the annulment proceedings. You are lying. You have never destroyed a document in your life. You kept the forged letter draft. You kept the payment receipts. You kept every scrap of evidence because you believed no one would ever look for it. The certificate is somewhere in this house, and you will tell me where it is. I will not. Then I will find it without your help. And when I do, the consequences for you will be considerably worse than they need to be. He left the room without waiting for her response. Lady Odessa remained standing at the breakfast table, her hands flat on the polished wood, her reflection staring back at her from its dark surface, with the face of a woman who has heard the first stones of her own fortress beginning to fall. Soren searched with a methodical fury that consumed the entire morning. He started with the obvious places: the estate office, the records room, the locked cabinet in the library where the family's legal documents were kept. Nothing. The marriage certificate was not filed where it should have been, because it had been removed deliberately and thoroughly from every official repository in the house. He broadened the search to Lady Odessa's bedchamber, working while she was confined to the morning room under Honoria's watchful eye. Her traveling trunk, her writing case, her jewelry box. Every drawer, every shelf examined and found wanting. It was Verity who found it. She had come to help, unable to sit idle while her future hung in the balance. Standing in Lady Odessa's bedchamber, she studied the room with a governess's practiced eye. She would not keep it with her other documents, Verity said quietly. Those are the instruments of her authority. The certificate is the one thing that undermines it. She would keep it separate, somewhere personal. Somewhere she could look at it and reassure herself that it was still contained. She looked around the room. Her gaze settled on the mantelpiece. Above it hung a portrait of the late Duke, Soren's father, painted in his prime. Lady Odessa had served his household for 30 years. She had been, by all accounts, devoted to him and to the idea of the family he represented. "The painting," Verity said. Soren looked at her. She crossed the room and lifted the heavy gilt frame away from the wall. Behind it, affixed to the back of the canvas with wax seals and a strip of linen, was a flat oilskin packet. Soren took it down. He opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. Inside was the marriage certificate, dated the 14th of April 1891, witnessed and signed, the seal of the registrar intact, the names written in the clear official hand of the clerk who had performed the ceremony. Soren Aldrich Calder and Verity Catherine Ashworth. Married in the parish church of Dunmere before witnesses and the law, it had never been annulled. The annulment that Lady Odessa had arranged was a fabrication, built on forged signatures and a complicit solicitor. The marriage was, and had always been, valid. Verity was still his wife. She had been his wife every day for the last 5 years, and their children were legitimate, born within a marriage that the law had never dissolved. Soren looked at Verity. She was staring at the certificate, her face pale, her lips pressed together against the rising tide of an emotion she could not name because it was too many emotions at once. She reached out and touched the edge of the paper with one fingertip, as if confirming that it was real and solid and not another lie dressed in parchment. "It was behind his portrait," she whispered. She hid it behind the face of the man whose trust she betrayed. There was nothing more to say in that room. Soren took the certificate, and together they walked downstairs. He summoned Lady Odessa to the library. He asked Verity to bring the children. When they arrived, the scene was arranged with a formality that befitted the gravity of what was about to happen. Soren stood behind his desk, the marriage certificate, and the collected evidence laid out before him. Lady Honoria sat in the window seat, her presence a silent witness and a final, implacable authority. And Lady Odessa stood before the desk, her face rigid, her hands clasped in front of her, a woman facing a tribunal she had spent a decade believing would never convene. Verity entered with the children. Rafferty walked in first, his hand in his mother's, his eyes wide as he took in the vast room, with its shelves of books stretching to the ceiling. Stellan followed close behind, his gaze fixed on his father's face, with that quiet, searching intensity that was already so distinctly his own. And Nev, the smallest, was carried on Verity's hip, her thumb in her mouth, her dark eyes moving from face to face with the solemn gravity of a child who understands more than she can articulate. Soren looked at them. His children, standing in his library, in the house where they should have been born, in the home they should have known since their first breath. Rafferty was studying the bookshelves with open wonder. Stellan had found a globe on a side table and was tracing the continents with one careful finger. Neve had laid her head against her mother's shoulder and was watching Soren with an expression of sleepy, unguarded interest. He looked at Lady Odessa and felt, in place of the rage he had expected, something colder and more final: disappointment. The absolute, irreversible disappointment of a man who has discovered that the foundation stone of his household was rotten from within. The marriage certificate, he said, holding it up, was found behind the portrait of my father in your bedchamber. The marriage was never annulled. The documents your solicitor prepared were fraudulent. Verity Catherine Ashworth has been, and remains, my wife, the Duchess of Dunmere. He let the title settle into the silence of the room. And these children, he paused, his voice thickening despite every effort to control it, are my legitimate heirs. Lady Odessa said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was comprehensive, the conspiracy laid bare in her own meticulous handwriting. She had been undone by the very quality that had made her so formidable, her compulsive, obsessive need to document, to record, to keep. You will leave Dunmere today, Soren said. A carriage will take you to the property at Helton Bridge. It is a small holding, remote, with a cottage and sufficient land to keep you occupied. You will have a pension adequate for your needs. You will have no contact with this family. You will not write. You will not visit. You will not send word through intermediaries. He paused. He looked at Verity, who stood with their children gathered around her, her face wet with silent tears that she did not bother to hide, and he made his final judgment not from anger, but from the quiet dignity he had learned, without knowing it, from her. It is more mercy than you showed my wife. It is more kindness than you showed my children, and it is the last act of generosity you will receive from this house. Lady Odessa's face crumpled, not into remorse, not into the contrition that might have softened the blow, but into the particular anguish of a woman whose life's work has been declared worthless by the one person whose approval she had spent decades courting. She had loved the Calder name. She had loved it more fiercely, more possessively, than she had ever loved the people who carried it. And that misplaced devotion had become a blade that severed the very bonds she claimed to protect. She left the room without a word. She did not look back. The door closed behind her with a quiet, final sound. The library was still. Neve, who had been watching the entire scene from the safety of her mother's arms, with the unblinking attention of a child who senses that the world is rearranging itself around her, lifted her head from Verity's shoulder. She looked at Soren. She'd looked at him for a long measuring time, with the grave, appraising stillness of a child deciding whether a person can be trusted with the whole of her small, fierce heart. Then she held out her arms to him. It was a small gesture. It was the most enormous gesture Soren had ever received. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took his daughter into his arms for the first time. She was lighter than he had imagined, warm and solid and achingly real, and she smelled of soap and milk and something indefinably sweet that he would later come to understand was simply what his children smelled like, the scent of everything he had been missing. She placed one small hand on his cheek. She patted it twice, gently, as if testing the surface of something she wanted to be sure was solid. "Father," she said, the same word her brother had spoken in the ballroom. But where Rafferty's had been a declaration to a stranger, Neva's was a question, a tentative, hopeful, courageous inquiry offered by a child who had only ever known her father as a painting and a name. "Yes," Soren whispered. His voice fractured completely. He did not care. He was beyond caring. "Yes, I am here." Rafferty needed no further invitation. He launched himself across the room and wrapped his arms around Soren's leg with the force of a small, joyful battering ram. Stellan followed more slowly, more carefully, as was his nature, but when he reached his father, he pressed his face against Soren's coat and held on with both hands, quietly, fiercely, as if he intended never to let go. Lady Honoria turned to the window. She pressed her handkerchief to her eyes and said nothing at all, because there was nothing in the language that could do justice to the sight of her son holding his children at last. Verity stood apart, watching. Tears ran down her face, but she was smiling. It was the first real smile Soren had seen from her since the day she had left this house 5 years and a lifetime ago, and it transformed her face the way spring transforms a landscape that has endured too long a winter. The children were taken to the nursery, a real nursery, hastily but lovingly prepared by Lady Honoria and 2 housemaids who had been weeping freely since the morning's revelations had swept through the servants' hall like a warm and cleansing wind. Rafferty went reluctantly, declaring he had not yet finished examining the globe. Stellan went quietly, carrying a book Soren had pressed into his hands. And Neve went only after Soren promised twice, in a voice that still was not entirely steady, that he would come to say good night. Soren and Verity were alone in the library. The fire had been lit. The evidence still lay on the desk between them. The marriage certificate, the forged letters, the ledger of payments, the intercepted love notes, the archaeology of a 5-year deception, laid out on mahogany. Soren spoke first. "I failed you. You were deceived. I was willing to be deceived. My mother was right. I chose anger over grief, because anger was easier to bear. I chose to believe you had left, because the alternative that you had been taken from me was a thought I could not survive." He paused. "That is not strength. That is cowardice, dressed in its Sunday clothes." Verity shook her head. "You did not know." "I should have known. I should have questioned her story. I should have looked at the evidence with the same rigor I applied to a drainage survey or a grain contract. Instead, I took the word of the one person who had opposed our marriage from the first day, and never once asked myself why she was so eager to confirm its failure." He walked to the window. The grounds of Dunmere stretched out before him, gray and gold in the late autumn light, unchanged and yet entirely transformed by the knowledge of what had happened within these walls. "The solicitors will restore everything," he said, his voice steadying into the practical register that was his natural refuge when emotion threatened to overwhelm him. "The marriage is valid. The children are legitimate. Their claim to the estate is beyond legal challenge. Your position as Duchess is intact, and always has been." He turned to face her. "But I am not going to stand here and tell you what your life must be. You have had half a decade of being told what to do and where to go by people who had no right to speak for you. I will not add my voice to that chorus." He crossed to the desk and placed his hand on the marriage certificate. "This document gives you your rights, but it does not compel you to exercise them. If you wish to stay at Dunmere, as my wife, as the mother of my children, as the Duchess of this house, I will spend the rest of my life attempting to deserve that decision. But if you wish to leave, to take the children to live independently on your own terms and in your own way, I will provide for that too, completely, generously, without condition and without resentment." He met her eyes. "You are free, Verity. For the first time in 5 years, you are entirely free, and I will not be the next person who tries to take that from you." The silence in the library was complete. The fire crackled softly. The mantel clock ticked its steady, unhurried rhythm. Somewhere in the upper floors of the house a child laughed, a bright, startling, beautiful sound in the great quiet of that ancient place, and both of them turned toward it instinctively, pulled by the same invisible thread. Verity crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and did something she had not done since the morning she walked down the gravel drive, with 50 pounds in her pocket and a breaking heart in her chest. She took his hand. "I did not come back for the certificate," she said quietly. "I came back because my children deserve to know their father, and because I spent 5 years trying to stop loving you, and I could not manage it. Believe me, I tried. It would have been so much easier." He closed his fingers around hers. He did not speak. He did not need to. The pressure of his hand said everything his words could not, and the silence that followed was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a room that has at last been filled. 6 months later, spring had come to Dunmere. The gray stone of the great house had softened in the April light, and the gardens, long neglected under Lady Odessa's utilitarian regime, had burst into extravagant color under the enthusiastic if unscientific direction of Rafferty, who had appointed himself head gardener and had planted daffodils in a formation that he claimed represented a dragon, but that more closely resembled a large and cheerful puddle. The library, once the fortress of Soren's solitude, was unrecognizable. Books still lined the walls from floor to ceiling, but the silence that had once defined the room was gone, replaced by a warm and constant hum of living. Stellan had claimed the window seat as his personal reading corner and could be found there most afternoons, working his way through an illustrated natural history with the same quiet concentration his father brought to estate ledgers. Nev had colonized the rug in front of the fireplace and conducted elaborate tea parties with a stuffed rabbit, a wooden horse, and whatever willing adult happened to wander within range. And Rafferty treated the entire room as a personal expedition, scaling the rolling ladder with a fearlessness that gave his mother palpitations and his father a pride he was careful to disguise as concern. Verity had not taken up the title of Duchess with any fanfare. There had been no formal announcement, no grand reception. The county had learned the truth, the way counties always learn things, through a steady current of gossip that carried the story from house to house until it became old news. The Duke's wife had been driven out by a scheming aunt. She had returned with his children. The family was restored. It was, by county standards, almost disappointingly wholesome. Lady Honoria had stayed through the winter, overseeing the transition with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had been waiting years for the opportunity to set right what her prolonged absence had allowed to go wrong. She had hired a new housekeeper, a warm and capable woman named Mrs. Calloway, who ran the household with an easy authority that invited loyalty rather than demanding it. She had refurbished the nursery, engaged a tutor for the children, and written a great many letters to a great many influential people, the contents of which she declined to share but which resulted in a steady stream of visitors, invitations, and quietly delivered gifts that wove the restored Duchess back into the fabric of county society with a seamlessness that bordered on artistry. She had returned to Florence in March, satisfied that her work was done, with a promise to return for the summer and a pointed remark to her son about the inadvisability of making the same mistake twice. Stellan, of the 3 children, had been the slowest to warm and the deepest to attach. Where Rafferty claimed his father with bold certainty and Nev offered her trust like a gift on an open palm, Stellan had watched. He watched for weeks, studying Soren with those quiet, tawny eyes, measuring the distance between the man and the portrait. And then one afternoon, without announcement, he had climbed into Soren's lap while the Duke was reading, settled against his chest, and fallen asleep. He had not explained. He had not asked permission. He had simply decided, in his own time, that this was where he belonged. Soren had not moved for 2 hours. He understood that this quiet boy had given him the rarest gift of all, trust that is earned rather than offered, and is, for that reason, unshakable. "Your mother," Verity said one evening, finding Soren in the library after the children were asleep, is a force of nature. She is a terrifying woman, Soren agreed, with the faintest trace of a smile. He was seated at his desk, but the ledgers were closed. A book of poetry lay open before him, a habit he had rediscovered in the last few months, or perhaps discovered entirely anew, since the man who now read poetry by the fire was not the same man who had sat behind this desk 6 months ago. I am profoundly grateful she is on our side. Verity smiled. She crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite his desk, the chair she had claimed as her own in the weeks after the reckoning. It was from this chair that she read in the evenings, while he worked. Their silence comfortable and companionable, the silence of two people who have learned that presence itself is its own form of conversation. The children want to go to the lake tomorrow, she said. Rafferty has announced he intends to build a boat. Rafferty announces many things. Last week he intended to construct a castle on the south lawn. He is ambitious. He is not yet 5, and has already exhausted the concept of reasonable ambition. Soren paused, and the smile that had been threatening broke through. We will go to the lake. They sat in easy quiet for a moment. The fire murmured in the grate. The old house settled around them with its familiar creaks and sighs, the particular music of a building that has stood for centuries and intends, with the patience of stone, to stand for centuries more. I need to say something to you, Soren said. Verity looked up from her book. His face was serious, but the severity that had once defined it, the granite mask he had worn like armor, was gone. In its place was something more open, more human, the face of a man who has discovered that walls keep out warmth as effectively as they keep out grief. When you came back to this house, he said, I told you that you were free, that you could stay or leave, and that I would support whichever you chose. Without condition, I meant it then, and I mean it now, but I find that I have been less than honest with you about one thing. Which thing? The part where I suggested I would be content with either outcome. He met her eyes. I would not be content if you left. I would be devastated. I would be a man standing in an empty library with a book of poetry and absolutely no idea what to do with the rest of his life. Verity's expression softened. She closed her book and set it aside. She waited. I was not a good husband the first time, he said. I was distant and too serious by half, and I treated emotion as if it were an engineering problem to be solved rather than a thing to be felt and lived. I cannot promise to be a wholly different man, but I can promise to be a more honest one, a more present one. He stood and came around the desk. He knelt beside her chair and took both of her hands in his, and the gesture, the Duke of Dunmere on his knees on his own library rug, was so unexpected and so entirely without performance that it took her breath away. I am asking you to stay, he said. Not out of duty, not out of obligation, not for the children, though heaven knows they are reason enough. I am asking you to stay, because this house was a mausoleum before you came back, and now it is a home. Because I spent 5 years believing I was not made for love, and you proved me wrong 3 times over, in 3 small, astonishing, exhausting, miraculous people who have your courage, and I am reliably informed, my stubbornness. Verity laughed. It was a full, warm, unguarded laugh, and it filled the library the way light fills a room that has had its curtains thrown open after a long and unnecessary darkness. You are reliably informed correctly, she said. They are impossibly stubborn. Then stay. Stay and be stubborn with me. Stay, and let Rafferty build his boats, and Stellan read every book in this library, and Neve Hay hold her tea parties on this rug until we are old and gray, and thoroughly outnumbered by our own children. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was the first kiss they had shared since before the night that had divided their lives in 2, and it was gentle and certain, and it tasted of salt, because they were both, finally, unashamedly weeping. I already stayed, she whispered against his mouth. I stayed the moment Rafferty took your hand in that ballroom. I have been staying every single day since. He pulled her close and held her, and for a long time neither of them spoke, because there are moments in a life where words are not insufficient but simply unnecessary, where the only language that matters is the steady, undeniable warmth of another person's heartbeat against your own. Later. Much later, a small sound came from the doorway. They looked up to find Rafferty standing there in his nightshirt, barefoot, his hair a dark tangle, his eyes bright with the particular alertness of a child who has sensed that something important is happening and has absolutely no intention of missing it. "Are you staying, Mama?" he asked. There was no worry in the question. It was the voice of a child confirming what he already knew. "Yes, my darling, I am staying," the boy nodded, satisfied. Then he looked at Soren. He tilted his head, just slightly, with the same appraising expression his sister had worn in the library on the day of the reckoning. "Father," he said, not a question this time. Not a declaration hurled across a ballroom at a stranger in a crowd, a name, simple and certain, spoken by a child to the man he was learning to know and beginning to love, in the house where they both at last belonged. "Yes," Soren said. His voice was rough and warm and steady. "I am here." Rafferty padded across the rug in bare feet, climbed into the narrow space between his parents, and settled there with the boneless, absolute contentment of a child who has found, after a long and uncertain journey, the precise place in the world he was always meant to be. The library at Dunmere Court was quiet, but it was not empty. It had not been empty for quite some time.